This afternoon's panel is going to have a focus on the Hamiltonian Revolution, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the Australian predicates for the Hamiltonian credit system. So I know that Robbie is very well known to all of you people here, so I'm going to hand over to him without any further introduction.
Thank you. There you go. All right, on the screen, what you call irony, and we'll see why. So the Hamiltonian Revolution and FDR's Glass-Steagall. Just, Aaron, is my mic working? Okay. So, you've just heard from Paul Gallagher in very stark terms that the most pressing challenge facing the world right now is rapidly reversing the general economic breakdown that is driving the world into war. It can be done, but it will require abandoning the general axioms of political economy that have prevailed for the past 3 decades. Paul Gallagher has described the economic crisis that has come from those axioms. Let me single out one symptom of the crisis: underinvestment in infrastructure. Infrastructure is not just another part of the economy. It is the platform on which the economy functions to meet the current and future needs of the population. The neoliberal financial policies that have taken over since the 1971 collapse of the Bretton Woods system have failed to produce the infrastructure that the world needs. Instead, the waves of speculation unleashed by financial deregulation siphoned investment away from all the priority sectors of the physical economy, especially infrastructure, and pumped it into speculative bubbles. The financial markets, commodity markets, housing bubbles, and the big one, the global derivatives bubble, that have been bursting since 2007-8. There is now a consensus worldwide of the urgent need to invest in infrastructure. In Australia, the so-called infrastructure deficit, that is what we should have spent but didn't, has been put at over $700 billion. US experts have warned for a long time of the parlous state of that country's infrastructure. In the 2009 documentary, The Crumbling of America, the American Society of Civil Engineers documented the advanced state of collapse of America's bridges, dams, water and sewage systems, power grids, etc., after decades of what they called deferred investment. Just put up on the screen the infrastructure report card. So they produced this, which they call the infrastructure report card, and there's I think the acronym is an American one, GPA, grade point average, and it's pretty much a fail. Now, if you haven't seen it, it's sort of lengthy, but just play the opening of the, this is a trailer for the documentary that the Society produced in conjunction with the History Channel called The Crumbling of America.
America's infrastructure is collapsing. We've had some shocking glimpses. The levees in New Orleans, the interstate bridge that went down in Minneapolis, the massive East Coast blackout of 2003.
Imagine a month-long blackout. Imagine major failures of water delivery system in the West. Imagine levee breakdowns that can't be repaired.
We're headed down the road, without much exaggeration, to being a second world or a third world country.
This is the United States of America. Why is our infrastructure in such bad shape?
All right, that'll do. You can watch the full documentary on YouTube, or I think there's copies of the video of it in our office. United States infrastructure spending at the end of the Eisenhower administration in 1961, Paul actually in his presentation put it in GDP terms of 3.5% of GDP. In the terms of the budget of government spending, it was 12.5% of the domestic budget. By 2009, that was down to 2.5% compared to China's 9%. The engineers estimated when they produced the documentary it would take 2.2 trillion. This report card is now raised up to 3.6 trillion over 5 years just to repair America's existing infrastructure to an acceptable level, let alone build more. But when Congress passed the $800 billion stimulus bill in 2009, only $72 billion was earmarked for infrastructure. European nations have similarly underinvested in infrastructure, and the most shocking statistic that I didn't have that Paul cited was negative investment in Germany for 10 years. Germany is supposed to be the powerhouse of Europe that's carrying everything else on its shoulders. That's stunning. In the UK, which I got to see last October, the economy outside of London is in desperate need of infrastructure and an economic recovery more generally, and that's the main factor driving the independence movements in places like Scotland and Wales. And of course, much of the developing world, particularly Africa, has been blocked from developing infrastructure on a scale commensurate with their needs, which has condemned many nations to seemingly endless poverty. It is worth noting that much of the destruction caused by severe weather events that nowadays gets blamed on climate change is in fact the result of poor and decaying infrastructure. So faced with this challenge, what can be done? Most nations are mired deep in debt. Haven't we run out of money? Just take Australia. We have a $50 billion budget deficit. How could we afford $700 billion for infrastructure? The solution to this challenge requires understanding the false premise underlying these questions, which is that money is necessary to build infrastructure. It is not, and this is not a theory. The first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, demonstrated this to the world 225 years ago. In so doing, he designed a unique monetary system of political economy called the American system, which, when used, drove America's spectacular development in the 19th and 20th centuries into the most powerful nation in the world as of the time, and inspired other nations, including Australia, to emulate them. However, before getting into the details of Hamilton's American system, let us first look at the other ways that experts today are proposing to address this infrastructure challenge. First, the least controversial, but also most unlikely, way to fund infrastructure is through taxes. This approach is limited at the best of times, but it is especially limited nowadays in this era of steep budget deficits. Infrastructure is expensive and long-term. Funding it out of short-term tax revenues is so difficult that it is usually relegated to the end of the list of priorities to become what the engineers called deferred investment. In truth, those who insist on funding infrastructure this way do so in order to ensure the infrastructure is never built. Take, for instance, the latest incarnation of a fast train from Melbourne to Brisbane. Next, please. These are the proposed, or the short list of corridors for the line. Now, you might remember this. The Gillard government in 2013 announced that this was a feasible project, but that it would cost $114 billion and take 50 years to build. They projected it would be completed in 2065. Almost by definition, a project over such a long time frame would never be built. And the reason for this ridiculous estimate is that it was to be entirely funded out of the annual budget. So we'll dole out a few dollars a year, and over 50 years it'll get built. Now, remember this example tomorrow when you listen to Jeremy Beck's presentation on the infrastructure China is building around the world and the timescale they're doing it in. A second way that is proposed to finance infrastructure is through private investment, or a combination of private investment and public funding, so-called public-private partnerships. This is all the rage in recent times, pioneered by Australia actually through schemes cooked up by Macquarie Bank. Investment banks and managed funds all over the world have teamed up in an organisation called the Long-Term Investors Club, which boasts of having over $90 trillion under management, in which they are seeking to invest in infrastructure projects. On the face of it, this intention sounds good, a win-win for investors and governments. But it is far from so, and Australia is the proof of that. Private investors do not fund infrastructure for infrastructure's sake. They want a return, and the highest returns possible. Banks such as Macquarie that specialise in this business prey on investment opportunities that they can structure to ensure the highest returns. They therefore tend to invest in toll roads, privatised utilities and similar infrastructure. Ports and airports are also favourites, which are effectively localised monopolies servicing a captive market on whom they can whack hefty user charges that cannot be avoided. Macquarie pioneered toll roads in Sydney, winning generous multi-decade concessions from the government that in some cases ensured that competitive infrastructure such as public transport rail lines would not be built parallel to their toll roads. Sydney is now crisscrossed with these toll roads, but traffic congestion is as bad as ever. Next slide. Here are the biggest problems with privately funded infrastructure. Whereas infrastructure is supposed to boost productivity, which makes economic activity cheaper, the hefty user charges on toll roads and airports end up making the infrastructure an economic burden on the user. And I think the latest figure I heard that if you're an average blue-collar worker who has to drive across Sydney to work, you'd be paying $50 in tolls a week out of your $650 wage. That's without your petrol and everything else taken into account. The second biggest problem is infrastructure should be built for the future, so its capacity should always exceed current demand. But private infrastructure seeks to maximise immediate returns, so it is often intentionally built only to meet current demand, if that, and is equally often soon overwhelmed. Toll roads get built with 3 lanes each way instead of 6 or 8, and later the users suffer extreme inconvenience and cities slow to a crawl when extra lanes have to be added. This decreases productivity and increases real costs to the economy. A third way to fund infrastructure is by governments borrowing money from private investors. Again, on the face of it, this is not the worst idea in the world, especially in today's economic climate. A lot of investors are so desperate for financial security above all else that they are keen to lend to governments. The interest rates on government bonds have probably never been so low. The Australian government went from 0 net debt in 2007 when Kevin Rudd was elected to around $300 billion in net debt today, and I'm talking about Commonwealth government debt, by the way, not Australia's foreign debt, which is always huge. And it's 0 to $300 billion, thanks to the deficits and stimulus the governments ran as a result of the global financial crisis. If just a portion of that borrowed money had been invested in nation-building infrastructure, such as the 18 major water projects that the CEC proposed in 2002, next slide, which were estimated would cost $40 billion, Australia's economy would be very different today, enjoying real prosperity. However, as good as this sounds, there is a danger with this approach. Most private money that goes into government bonds is not invested by individuals, but by fund managers and banks working in tandem, or you could say hunting in packs, the so-called financial markets. The financier elite who dominate these markets are of the conviction that they are a power above governments and should dictate to governments. Their ideological stooges in many governments share this conviction. In April 2012, Joe Hockey, then opposition Treasury spokesman, gave a speech to the Thatcherite Institute for Economic Affairs in London in which he endorsed the bank's dictating austerity on the nations of Europe. Quote, "In today's global financial system, it is the financial markets, both domestic and international, which impose fiscal discipline on countries," Hockey said. "Lenders have a more active role to play in policing public policy and ensuring that countries do not exceed their capacity to service and repay debt," end quote. Presently, Egypt is consciously guarding against this danger with regard to its second Suez Canal project to avoid a repeat of the fight over control of the original Suez Canal. To ensure its sovereign control of the project, the Egyptian government is funding it through loans exclusively from everyday Egyptian citizens. This is a win-win-win. The government puts the people's money to work on a project that creates jobs and improves their lives. The money and repayments stay in Egypt, boosting the local economy, and Egypt isn't obligated to the London and Wall Street elite or their agents in the IMF and World Bank. Let us now turn to a fourth way of funding infrastructure, but which doesn't actually belong on the list, because it is a revolutionary advance on the assumptions underpinning all the three previous options which we have so far discussed. They are all options within a monetary system. We will now discuss Alexander Hamilton's American system of political economy, which was actually an evolutionary leap forward, if you will, from a monetary system to a credit system. Hitherto I've used the term money, but now we must think rigorously so that we understand the concept of credit. The LaRouche Political Action Committee's 2013 draft legislation to restore the original Bank of the United States provides the following contrasting definitions of monetary and credit systems. Monetarism constantly looks backward to the past with the aim of monetising the results of past production rather than the creation of new wealth. The credit system operates on the intention of and confidence in the future. Rather than depending on past production or stores of wealth, it creates wealth by tying the future completion of projects and production of goods and manufactures to the original promise. The currency of monetarism is formed by the liquidation of present goods into money. In the credit system, rather than the products of growth, growth itself is the currency. Alexander Hamilton's thinking during the American War of Independence and afterwards was influenced by a century of conflict between the American colonies and their faraway overlord, Great Britain, over control of their currencies. The British insisted that currency had to be specie, gold and silver coins. The argument was that only such specie currency would be sound. But in truth, it kept the colonies under tight control. It also suffocated the colonial economies. Gold and silver mainly came by ship from Europe, so that the natural daily economic activities of farming, hunting, trapping for the purposes of trade was severely restricted by an insufficient supply of currency. Colonists had to resort to inefficient bartering, etc. Determined to develop, colonial leaders thought this issue through and realised that although short of currency, they had plenty of wealth. They had fertile land, plentiful resources, and skilled farmers, fishermen and tradesmen to produce the wealth. So what was money but a medium of exchange for the wealth they already possessed, and not wealth in and of itself? Part 2 of the World Land Bridge Report, which is in the section called Financing the Global Land Bridge 2064, which is by Paul Gallagher and Michael Kirsch, provides the history of the development of the American colonists' thinking on this issue over the 120 years from 1652, when Massachusetts minted its own coin called the Pine Tree Shilling against the wishes of the Crown, to explicit proposals to establish colonial banks that could issue bills of credit, not metal coins, as the medium of exchange, to the common use of such bills of credit and the Crown's repeated crackdowns, and ultimately to the colonists declaring independence in 1776, an action provoked in no small part by this conflict over the financial systems. In 1795, Alexander Hamilton wrote the following definition and explanation of public credit, informed by the history of American thinking on this issue which he knew well. Now, bear with me here, because we're going to get slightly technical, but once you wrap your mind around this, then you kind of, tend to look at the economy in a completely different way for all time. And of course, it's what we have to be able to take forward when we're trying to explain this to elected members of parliament, etc. So this is the gist of credit that he's explaining here in this quote. Public credit has been well defined to be a faculty to borrow at pleasure considerable sums on moderate terms. The art of distributing over a succession of years the extraordinary efforts found indispensable in one, a means of accelerating the prompt employment of all of the abilities of a nation, and even of disposing of a part of the overplus, which we'd say surplus, of others. It is among the principal engines of useful enterprise and internal improvement. As a substitute for capital, it is little less useful than gold or silver in agriculture, in commerce, in the manufacturing and mechanic arts. It is a matter of daily experience in the most familiar pursuits. One man wishes to take up and cultivate a piece of land. He purchases upon credit and, in time, pays the purchase money out of the produce of the soil improved by his labour. Another sets up in trade. In the credit founded upon a fair character, he seeks and often finds the means of becoming at length a wealthy merchant. A third commences business as manufacturer or mechanic with skill but without money. It is by credit that he is enabled to procure the tools, the materials, and even the subsistence of which he stands in need until his industry has supplied him with capital. And even then he derives from an established and increased credit the means of extending his undertakings. So just as we heard earlier, Hamilton is saying that credit is giving value to future production. Any individual can credit anyone's efforts, but Hamilton knew that no entity is better equipped to provide credit for future wealth than the government, which can back its credit with the resources of the entire nation. This is the attitude with which he confronted the enormous challenges facing America after its victory in the War of Independence in 1783. It was no small task. The new republic was so heavily in debt, it was effectively bankrupt and vulnerable to Britain's ongoing financial warfare. Thomas Jefferson and his allies had produced a first constitution which left the central government weak and powerless over the 13 states. In this period, a national bank called the Bank of North America failed because the national government was not strong enough to support it. Hamilton was part of an opposing faction, including Ben Franklin, which organised a new constitutional convention that produced the US Constitution in effect, ostensibly, today. This constitution gave the federal government real power to direct a unified nation as opposed to a jumble of states. George Washington was elected as the first president of the US, and he chose Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury. They assumed office and the new Congress commenced in 1789. Alexander Hamilton was determined that America should honour its war debts. He called them the price of liberty. But he knew that organising the government and the economy so that it was capable of paying the debt would require institutions and policies and a focus on development that is exactly what America needed. It would set America up for a prosperous future. In 1781, he made the amazing declaration to banker Robert Morris, who helped finance the revolution, quote, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing." Someone tell Joe Hockey that. The United States in 1789 had $42.4 million in domestic debt, $11.7 million in foreign debt, and the 13 individual states had $21.5 million in debt between them. Hamilton's first act was counterintuitive. He increased the national debt by taking the responsibility for paying the state debts onto the federal government. Such an action would be unthinkable to the unbalanced minds of today's monetarists who are obsessed with debt and budget balancing. But it was key to Hamilton's plan. He intended to make the US government's pledge to honour that debt so watertight that it turned this national liability into a national asset. So here are the technical details of how Hamilton achieved this. He raised a new loan for the whole amount of the domestic and state debts combined, which was added up 63.9 million, from the existing debt holders. They were asked to turn in, they had these debt certificates, they were asked to turn them in because those recorded their claim against the government, and they were given new ones in exchange. The new ones had a lower interest rate. They were 4% compared to the old ones of 6%. So what he did in doing this is he refinanced the debt on better terms by rolling it over. Now, the reason this was an attractive proposition to the existing debt holders was that Hamilton tied this new loan directly to the means of paying it. This was something of an obsession of Hamilton's. He called it a, quote, fundamental maxim in the system of public credit of the United States that the creation of a debt should always be accompanied with the means of its extinguishment. In principle, this means that credit should be directed into productive endeavours which will create the wealth that can pay it back. Hamilton applied this principle by including, in the same Act of Congress that authorised his new rollover loan, provisions that allocated the government's tax revenue to paying back this new debt. Thus, when citizens exchanged their old debt certificates for the new ones, they knew that the repayments on that debt were the government's priority. Even at the lower interest rate of 4%, the new debt was a better deal because its repayment was assured compared to the uncertainty of repayment on the old debt certificates that most had held since the Revolutionary War. In Hamilton's words, this action, quote, restored the public credit. Americans had such confidence in this new debt certificate, they became the basis for an increase in the currency supply, precisely as Hamilton had intended. Gold and silver were so scarce that the economy was suffocating, but debt holders could take their certificates to their banks to exchange for bills of credit that they could use as currency. There was no national currency as of yet. The individual banks produced their own notes. But the government's IOU, which is effectively what it was as good as gold. In keeping with Hamilton's maxim that the debt must be tied to the means of paying it, Hamilton intended to harness this expanded credit in the economy so that it could be directed into productive activity that would increase the nation's wealth. To achieve this, he established a national bank. Hamilton was experienced in national banking because of his role during the war with the Bank of North America, which was crucial to the war effort. But in the 6 years between the end of the war and 1879, the weak central government was not able to maintain this bank and it collapsed. With the advantage of a much stronger national government, Hamilton knew a national bank would succeed. Slide. The National Bank, called the First Bank of the United States, started with $10 million in capital. Of this, the government paid $2 million in gold and silver to subscribe 20% of it. The balance of $8 million came from subscriptions from citizens. Hamilton's stroke of genius was to direct the expanded credit in circulation in the form of the government debt IOUs into this bank so that it could be further directed into specifically productive ventures. He achieved this by allowing the citizens who subscribed to the bank's startup capital to use their existing debt certificates to pay for 3/4 of their subscription. Thus, Hamilton recycled the original ironclad pledge to honour America's debts, circulating as credit through the economy in the government IOUs, into $6 million of the $10 million capital of the new bank. The First Bank of the United States commenced operations in 1791. It had sufficiently large capital that the banknotes it issued became the new national currency. It loaned heavily to the Treasury to fund US government operations and to private borrowers in industry. In so doing, it didn't leave industry at the mercy of the market to meet the need for industry's credit. The bank enabled the government to harness and direct credit in those areas. In his next report to Congress on the 5th of December 1791, Hamilton was able to comment on the impact of the National Bank was already having by directing public funds into resource development, manufactures and commerce. This is what he said, quote, "In a sound and settled state of the public funds, a man possessed of a sum in them can embrace any scheme of business which offers with as much confidence as if he were possessed of an equal sum in coin. Industry in general seems to have been reanimated. There appears to be in many parts of the Union a command of capital which till lately, since the Revolution at least, was unknown. And in his report to Congress that same year, he attacked the claims being made that the National Bank's issuance of public credit was taking business away from the private banks, one of the arguments used against national banking today, by pointing out that public credit complements private credit. Quote, if the individual capital of this country has become more adequate to the exigencies than formerly, it is because individuals have found new resources in the public credit, in the funds to which that has given value and activity. Let public credit be prostrated and the deficiency will be greater than before. Public and private credit are closely allied, if not inseparable. There is perhaps no example of the one being in a flourishing where the other was in a bad state. A shock to public credit would, therefore, not only take away the additional means which it has furnished, but by the derangements, disorders, distrusts, and false principles that it would engender and disseminate, would diminish the antecedent resources of private credit. This then was the public credit system that Alexander Hamilton invented. A government which thinks money is wealth and that such money is in finite supply will always be subservient to those who control the supplies of money. But a government which understands that true wealth is the human creativity and technology and production that ensures the future growth of the economy is not bound by the existing supplies of money. It is not limited to obtaining existing funds of money, whether through taxes or borrowings, to fund infrastructure. The government can, through the agency of a national bank, issue credit against the future growth that the infrastructure will generate. And you heard from Paul earlier, and then from people like Michael Meacher before that, there is a broad understanding today of just how straightforward this can be done. Hamilton's National Bank operated until 1811, and then another one, the Second Bank of the United States, operated very successfully from 1816 to 1836 when Wall Street killed it off. In the history of the United States and the world since, there have been periods when the American system was applied with great success, but longer periods when it was suppressed by private interests, financial interests hell-bent on dominating governments. Let's look at two other US presidents who successfully applied Hamilton's principles, Abraham Lincoln and Ben Franklin. So this is another irony. But on the other hand, America would not have had a paper currency without people like Lincoln and Hamilton. So, Abraham Lincoln was a leading advocate of Hamilton's American system of political economy his whole life. In 1832, when he was a young man campaigning for the state legislature in Illinois, he would introduce himself when campaigning with a beautifully succinct statement of the American system. Quote, I presume you all know who I am. I am humble Abraham Lincoln. My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I am in favour of a national bank, the internal improvement system, and a high protective tariff. And some of you are probably wishing that it could be explained that succinctly this afternoon to you, so this didn't go on too long. But it does show that we've kind of lost touch with the general understanding that existed back then, because people just don't get it. We do have to go through some of the details. Okay, when he was president during the Civil War, Lincoln revived Hamilton's system to fund both the war and an economic development program that initiated the greatest birth of economic growth in world history, matched only by China's development in the last few decades, and maybe not even that. At the time of his election in 1861, America once again had no national currency. Individual banks issued their own individual notes as currency. One of the problems this led to was counterfeiting, which got so serious that pamphlets had to be circulated explaining the genuine notes from forgeries. Not to be deterred, the counterfeiters simply counterfeited the pamphlets too. In short, the system was a mess. At the end of 1861, following the eruption of the Civil War, Wall Street ganged up with British and French lenders to deny funds to the US government. This was a demonstration of Wall Street's relationship with the City of London, under the control of which the British had allied with the South. There is, of course, a parallel between this financial blockade of Lincoln's government and the West's economic sanctions on Russia today. Incidentally, Russia supported Lincoln in the Civil War. However, the banks miscalculated against Lincoln, perhaps not fully aware just how conversant he was with Hamiltonian national banking. He simply took control of the currency by issuing US Treasury notes to be a circulating medium, unbacked by any gold or silver, as convention demanded. These were called greenbacks, after the colour of the printing on the back of the notes. And this one, I think it's a $2 greenback, that is Hamilton on there. They were incredibly successful. All up, Lincoln's Treasury issued $460 million in greenbacks during the war to fund a 300% increase in government spending. The Treasury between 1862 and 1864 issued $500 million worth of 20-year bonds to fund the greenbacks. Very importantly, to ensure that banks and speculators would not be able to manipulate the currency that these bonds underpinned, the bonds were not tradable. Lincoln also rechartered state banks as national banks to provide a network of financial institutions through which the government could direct credit. Aside from financing the war, greenbacks also funded the commencement of the great transcontinental railroads that opened up the interior to population and development, which drove such rapid economic growth that within a few decades the US was the strongest and largest economy in the world. Alas, the assassination of Lincoln in 1865 took out a leading intellect of Hamilton's American system economics, and the Wall Street bankers reasserted control. Lincoln's successors in the presidency systematically reduced the circulation of greenbacks until finally, in 1879, the currency was again chained to gold and silver. Finally, let's look at how Franklin Roosevelt revived Hamiltonian banking to fund great infrastructure projects in the Great Depression. Following the October 1929 stock market crash, American banks started crashing in their hundreds. President Hoover was captive to the Wall Street interests whose fraudulent gambling had caused the crash. So his response to the crisis was to try to bail out their banks ahead of the millions of people whose lives were ruined. He established a credit institution with the impressive name of Reconstruction Finance Corporation, not to fund reconstruction projects to create jobs, as the name implied, but to bail out the banks. It failed miserably. If I had more time at this point, I'd talk about the Pecora Commission, because what Roosevelt did would not have been possible without that. If you don't know about the Pecora Commission, we've written enough about it, try and find out. And there's an excellent book you can read called The HELLHOUND of Wall Street. And not to embarrass her, but we have a sort of a one-man band Pecora Commission over there near the door. Denise Bradley, just put up your hand, Denise. Denise is the watchdog on Australian banks and their criminality in Australia. So if you have an issue with banks, go and talk to Denise about it. She does a brilliant job. But what happened in America was this Ferdinand Pecora. It's a funny story because you have this period before a president is elected in America. Before he's inaugurated, between the election and inauguration, it's called the lame duck period, and they're just waiting for the new administration to take charge. And there was a senator from Nebraska who was a well driller, and his constituents were farmers, and he was just a no-nonsense guy named Peter Norbeck. And he was in charge of this committee that was supposed to overlook Wall Street, and it really hadn't accomplished much in all the time, and he was tempted to wind up the committee, but he decided to have one more crack at it, and he gave the job of counsel to this committee to a New York prosecutor named Ferdinand Pecora. And I think one of the key things about Pecora is he was not a banker, he was a lawyer. And when he got access to some of the documents of what the New York banks were up to, because still by 1933 they were the gods of Olympus, they were the masters of the universe, they were so respectable, they were not blamed for the crash. and they were sitting pretty even though they'd caused it. And he looked over documents that to a banker looked like standard banking practice, but to his lawyer's mind looked like fraud. And he then, it was broadcast live on radio, he put Wall Street on trial, and these bankers, the top bankers in America, came, some willingly at first, to questioning, assuming they could just pull the wool over the eyes of these committees like they always had. But this time they couldn't, and he got them, in their own words, to confess to being stock swindlers and tax avoiders and fraudsters. And in those 10 days, it changed the culture of the United States. It got the American, that's where the term banksters was invented then. It got the American people to turn against this as a class. They realised that the misery they were suffering was created by their practices. They got to see those practices writ large, and a lot of the details of the kinds of stuff that Denise has documented similarly for Australia. And the person who paid the most attention was Franklin Roosevelt. And he actually changed his famous inauguration address. So he had added a line after the introduction, which is, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," because these hearings were 10 days before his inauguration. Just changed everything to say that the high priests of the money changers of the temple have been found guilty in the court of public opinion, right? And they've fled from their high office. And what effectively happened was it put Wall Street on the ropes. And when Roosevelt knew that Wall Street was on the ropes, he seized the opportunity. And the opportunity he seized is what he then did. Roosevelt, in his first 100 days following his inauguration in 1933, enacting sweeping reforms that did not fully revive all of Hamilton's system, but got very close to it. One of these laws was Glass-Steagall, which completely separated the commercial banks that service the real economy from all forms of speculative investment banking. Glass-Steagall also set up the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to give government protection to those commercial banks. This separation ensured a functional credit system. The savings that workers put in their banks were only for normal lending to the home buyers, farmers and businessmen of the real economy. This kept the credit circulating through the real economy. In fact, because of the FDIC insurance, it allowed the banks to actually keep less capital in reserve because they could be confident that they were insured, and therefore more money in circulation in the real economy. As is well known, for the 66 years this law was in place, America had no major banking crises. Another Roosevelt initiative was the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. This was in the same spirit as Glass-Steagall. Protect those who want to invest their money rather than just keep it in the bank from the predations of speculators by putting a guard dog on the financial markets. This way, even investment bankers would have an incentive to find secure investment opportunities in the real economy that can actually help the country. Roosevelt was not able to achieve his policy of creating national credit banks for industry, which got blocked in Congress as Wall Street fought back. But he did the next best thing. He took Hoover's agency for bailing out bankers, the RFC, Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and put it to use funneling public credit into the physical economy. Roosevelt knew that Congress would block funding for many of the infrastructure projects he intended to build to put people to work. But the beautiful thing about the RFC is its funding mechanism had already been approved under Hoover, and it didn't require going to Congress for permission. So Roosevelt funded his projects through it. The RFC was initially authorised to lend $2 billion in 1933 to 34, but by 1955 it had actually ended up lending $50 billion, all of which was repaid. It expanded its operations by borrowing from the Treasury and by reissuing all of the repaid loans and interest as new credit. And a lot of that, if you think about Glass-Steagall itself, with that protection for the real economy, when it's something like the RFC is used to fund projects, that money ends up effectively in the pockets of workers when it percolates down to workers. And where do they put it? In their bank, and keep it on the right side of the Glass-Steagall divide, right? And so these credit mechanisms both created projects but kept expanded the credit in the real economy on a permanent basis. I was going to go through some of the specific details. You can read it in publications like this from March 2012, LaRouche Pack called NWAPA 21, which goes through it. Needless to say, a lot of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation had a role in pretty much everything you've ever heard of in terms of infrastructure constructed under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. So, in conclusion, the three instances of Hamiltonian public credit we've looked at were all applied during times of crisis with great success. A crisis should not be a prerequisite for resorting to public credit, but it often happens that because that is when the opponents of public credit, the private banking interests, are usually most discredited in the eyes of the public and therefore politically weak. We are now in another time of crisis. The world is plunging into an economic breakdown crisis that will destroy the power of the City of London and Wall Street and the economic consensus they have enforced on the world through the IMF and the World Bank. In the face of this threat, the Anglo-American powers are going for war. There can be no solution to this crisis unless nations break with the monetarism that is the cause of the economic breakdown and adopt the Hamiltonian principles of public credit instead. The issue with public credit is less the mechanisms used and more the intention for which it is used. Paul Gallagher has described the Hamiltonian overtones in the intention of the BRICS nations to create international credit institutions to finance economic development. Next, Craig will cover the history of how the Commonwealth Bank was a Hamiltonian institution used to develop Australia. When credit is harnessed by governments and directed into development, it gives value to the future economic growth which supports us all and is therefore the source of true wealth. Thank you.